Welcome back. Working on a course set of modules on respectful communication and conflict, piloting certain modules. In an earlier video, which I'll link here, I laid out the overall set of systems in which I'm proposing that on. And that starts with a self, me or you, a self at the center. And then that self is nested in a bunch of circles that all influence each individual within our societies, within our nations, and they have a huge impact on communication. And behaviors that each of us have are essentially a form of communication, in a sense, whether it's to ourselves, whether it's to those around us, whether it's to other critters. Behaviors are communication. And in my experience in designing curriculum and teaching different courses and taking different courses, I find that interpersonal communication, and probably more importantly, intrapersonal, the internal communication, is not very well covered. And there's probably a lot more that needs to be done in these areas to assist folks in appreciating how complicated communicating with other people actually can be and is. And a lot of the courses that I've seen get into some of the basics and talk about body language and tone, and these are all important components of communication. I've often argued in a logical sense that there's far more to this, that if we bring a bit of awareness to those, it might really assist us. And so if we start at the core with a self, and that self is influenced and impacted by others around them. And some of you out there in the academic world may recognize this, and Urie Bronfenbrenner was one of the early theorists around this in the 70s, talking about child development and suggesting that children are influenced by many factors in their development, and seems to be absolutely right. And it's a whole set of systems within systems and structures that influence that. So we have a self at the center, we have others that surround that. That is everything from family, who have an absolute direct impact on each of us as we age and get older, and in our child development through to adult, and having those family members pass on. These are our friends, peers, colleagues, our neighbors, the random folks that we interact with when we're out in society. So the others sit out and around and have a huge impact on each of us individually. Then out and around that are the systems and the institutions. And there's some argument whether systems and structures go each way or this way. And in this video, I actually want to focus all the way out onto the outside on the structures. And the structures is what I suggest in here, and others in different types of models related to this talk about are the really big ticket items, but they have an absolute and complete impact on each individual and through interpersonal communication. And so those are things like the constitution of countries. And our constitution, when I say that here in Canada, for those that, for example, structures influence these types of things. So a passport and citizenship. And the Constitution of Canada, for example, and the Constitution in other countries lays out who's a citizen and how that plays out. And then things, for example, here's my old birth certificate that was given in British Columbia. And so there are some things that are shared between the federal government and the provincial or territorial governments and other forms of government across. So the big ticket structural items that have a huge influence on each of us individually, no matter where you live, often starts with the constitution of the nation. And in Canada, going back to social studies classes, if you took them, or history, or in the midst of taking them, the Constitution has two sections, Section 91 and Section 92. Section 91 lays out what the federal government is responsible for. Section 92 lays out what provincial governments are responsible for. And then there's a Section 95, which talks about some shared responsibilities. And there's some shared responsibilities around agriculture and immigration and some other components. And over the years, and in the full outside, if this was a 3D model, is time and history, which I'll talk about in another video. That time and history has a big impact even on how the Constitution plays out, because when it was originally formed in the 1800s, it hadn't foreseen everything that a nation would need to deal with. And so over time, how those divisions of responsibilities has changed. The Constitution of Canada has so many impacts on so many people, but it's rarely ever taught in an interpersonal communication course. It deems everything from the citizenship, if folks identify as Indigenous or are recognized as such through the Indian Act, which is still in force in Canada. It's still called the Indian Act. That is a federal responsibility under Section 91, which then means that things are deemed reserves for use of, at the time when it was formed, the Indians, the Indian Act, and that language has shifted over time, but the Act is still called the same. But within that are things such as identity, and similar to myself as a white settler in Canada, I may have a passport, but there are status cards that are also the responsibility of the federal government, and it creates quite a complex relationship with provinces where reserves and Indigenous people live. There are impacts on things such as taxation and lots of myths that are developed around that. But it's really important concept for folks that work with Indigenous communities, in Indigenous communities, around Indigenous communities, and Indigenous peoples themselves will certainly share the impact of this, and that comes from the big structural pieces. Also included in structures at the constitutional level are things such as banking and bankruptcy courts, things such as the military, currency, the money that we use on a daily basis. Another huge impact on people is borders. You think about different communities that exist on the edge of a border, or how many Indigenous communities were split right down the middle by a border. Think of the Coast Salish peoples in Vancouver Island and northern Washington, northwestern Washington. Think of Haida peoples on the northwest coast of British Columbia and Alaska, and then further up north into the Yukon, and then all the way around where there's different international boundaries that have split Indigenous peoples and languages right down the center or carved off pieces of. And also within is criminal law. That's why it's called Corrections Canada, and how people may face sanctions under criminal law and then be served by Corrections Canada as opposed to being in a provincial prison, those types of things. And then another huge part of the structural impacts is the Supreme Court of Canada, and then how legislation and law, how that plays out. Think, for example, marriages, same-sex marriages. It originally was recognized within the Supreme Court of Canada and then eventually was turned into legislation, but it was first case law and precedent and then became legislation. And so other pieces such as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and then the international commitments that are made as a nation have a big impact. And so you start to think about those big structural components and how much they influence and have an influence on people's communication, but maybe have started to escape people's thinking on how much there is an impact there. And sometimes, and I've certainly learned this over my work over the years, and lots of really good work happening under the umbrella of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, there are things such as Aboriginal rights and title, and lots of people learning about that. That was decided within the Supreme Court of Canada. Case law builds and changes over time and impacts relationships and impacts how people are working together, and has a big impact on people's intrapersonal inside lives. And so we might run into conflict with somebody who's different from ourselves in an organization, and the root of that might actually be out there in those structural components, because things such as identity have largely been decided by a whole force outside. And you can hear conversations about colonization and things such as quote-unquote crown land. These are the legislative and laws and the structures that have a huge impact into the nested circles such as systems. And for example, as I was sharing, different systems like banking, education, and healthcare are a provincial responsibility, and yet pretty much any citizen in any province or territory across the country will interface and interact with those systems. And I'll talk more about that in the video on systems, but it's those structures that dictate what happens largely, or how those systems take shape, or at least who has responsibility for them, and then it plays out from there. And all of those start to press down onto each individual within, and it may be the root of where some conflict comes from. So that's where I've placed it in here as an absolutely critical part of respectful communication and conflict, is having some awareness of those, because sometimes that can take certain conflicts away from being me versus you or a dichotomized us versus them to a certain degree, to recognize that actually there are structures and influences outside of that conflict that are guiding what can occur within that conflict. So I'll talk more about that in another video. So that is the structural circle and structural pieces that are part of respectful communication and conflict.